There are a lot of different 8-scale platforms on the market today, but to the untrained eye, it would seem as though the only difference between all the buggies on the track would be their paint scheme. It's why in my every 8-scale buggy part 2 video, I was able to use the rough shape of one buggy and just use that to depict them all by color. The only one I couldn't do that with though was the subject of this video. The Agama N1e is probably the most unique buggy on the market today, and in this video we'll see if Agama's design gamble actually paid off, or if this design will simply be another footnote in the world of RC racing. Before we begin, I'd like to thank my sponsors, starting with RC Trophy Chasers. RC Trophy Chasers is a hobby shop based in the Carolinas, and they carry DFX batteries, Motive motors, and Mach 1 servos, all of which I've personally tested and very much approve of. If you'd like to get your hands on any of these or any other things like bodies, pinion gears, charging leads, and other accessories, be sure to check out their website below, rctrophychasers.net, and use code ROACHRC565 to save 10% off. I'd also like to thank CalRC for supporting me for so long. CalRC is the premier location to go get your RC cleaning needs. I've personally been using their silicone protector, bearing cleaner, and chassis cleaner, and especially their tire cleaner for a very long while now, and they've served me quite well. Be sure to check out their website in the description below and use code ROACHRC to all caps to save a bit on your next order. Lastly, we have A-Main Hobbies. I don't think I need to explain them very much. Anything you guys purchase using the link in the description below, along with any other codes I've mentioned before, will directly support me as well. Right. Agama as we know them now is a joint Taiwanese and British company that for the life of me I have not been able to find much history on. The most relevant thing I can say about them in the modern RC world is that before Ryan Lutz ran for Kyosho, he ran Agama. After he left, however, there weren't very many people running the, at the time, Agama 215 buggy outside of Nemo Raceway. Agama understood that to make headway in the world of RC racing in terms of people talking about you need to think outside the box. And thus, we now have the N1 platform. Despite its odd design, which I promise I'll get to later, the car was supposedly designed to be accessible and easy to work with for anyone who is willing to pick it up. It's not like how a few companies do it where they design the buggy around a very select top group of people in their inner circle. Despite the weird design, it was meant to be a buggy that anyone from a pro-level driver to a beginner could get the grasp of. Did they manage to pull this off? Let's find out. Before we get into how the car drives, let's finally talk about the build and the N1e's design. Now, to be perfectly honest, I did not build this car myself. It was built by a good friend and patron of mine, Morrison Wan. It was built with the VRP long travel set already installed, we'll get to that rabbit hole a little bit later, and it had been run maybe once on track. Luckily, it came with a manual, so I can get a good idea of how the N1 is like to build. From what I can tell from the manual itself, well, I might get some perturbed looks when I say this, but the car sort of goes together like a techno. The manual itself isn't as detailed as the technos are. Everything is a line drawing rather than a fully illustrated color illustration. But what I mean is that the process and progress is very similar to a techno and other 8-scale builds that I really enjoy. First, you build the front and rear parts of the car, then you build the center chassis up, and you're pretty much done from there. Even though the manual isn't as detailed as I'd like it to be, it still gets the job done in explaining clearly and simply what you're supposed to do and how to do it. As for working on it outside and building it, in reference to maintenance and such, I haven't had much issue working on the N1e. Everything is fairly easy to get to, including the shocks, and surprisingly even the diffs are easy to get to. Have the top shock swing out and expose the diff cover screws onto those, and the diff cover sort of just pops out. This also includes the diff sun gears, which after removing the top diff cover, front or rear, the ring gear will also just pop out. If you want more in-depth videos covering the build of the N1 platform, I'd highly recommend checking out Shawnee RC's channel. He did a video talking about the build of the car specifically. I'll link that in the description below. Now, the shocks. You've probably noticed them by now, so why don't we talk about them? As you can probably see, the N1e has no shock towers in the traditional sense. Instead, they are laid down horizontally over the front and rear gearboxes and attached to the arms via these little shock mounts instead. The idea is to create a shock that is fully consistent throughout its entire travel and to keep it consistent throughout long mains without side load. It also helps keep the weight low in theory and keeps the car from rolling over as easy on really high grip tracks. Like I said before, this isn't entirely a new design. Other cars have tried moving the shocks in different ways similar to this, but it is probably the first modern 8-scale package and the first to be mass produced and not be a conversion kit or something like that, though you can correct me if I'm wrong in the comments below. As a result of this design, the front shocks are comically small and the rear shocks are about the same size as other 8th scale buggy front shocks. The shocks themselves, though, are bigger in bore. I believe they are 17mm instead of the usual 16, and they come with bladders in the shock caps. However, there is an emulsion shock cap option you can either buy aftermarket or straight from Agama. Overall, it's a deceptively simple system that's easy to work on and easy to maintain. The last thing I want to mention about the Agama N1e specifically is the fact that you can run pretty much any and all battery types you wish. You can run the regular 4S shorty pack like you see here, the regular saddle pack system that's seen in many different cars these days, a 4S shorty pack like you'd see in a Mugen, and even the Losi style with two 2S packs lengthways across the side of the chassis. Overall, I like the design of the buggy on paper. It does work reasonably well, but how exactly does it perform where it matters? Driving time. What you're seeing here is the car in a slightly new layout at Loganville RC Complex when it was really dry and dusty, after the race was done and people were just doing practice. Now, I will say I was having some electrical issues throughout the day with my battery terminals coming out, but I was able to somewhat sort it out and finish my main. As for how the car drives on its own, well, it drives very nicely actually. The car absolutely loves to rotate at pretty much any and all speeds, so having a gentle steering hand is quite important to driving the Agama successfully, especially on those loose surfaces where you don't have high amounts of grip. Another thing that surprised me was just how much grip coming out of the corner I actually had. I had assumed with this much steering at speed, the car would want to oversteer coming out of a corner too, as well as sort of skate across the surface when speed was gained. Luckily, this was not the case, and the car, even with the big pinion gear, loved to accelerate out of corners. There are certain parts of the track where I did have to pace to go very well in Pro class, particularly more technical parts. Jumping the Agama is also fairly simple for the most part. Even though it may not land as gracefully as a Techno with their extreme amounts of suspension travel, it was very much good enough to deal with a lot of hard, flat landings from me overshooting jumps. Overall, on a lower grip day at Loganville RC Complex, the car handled very well without much issue. Another day, another track. This time we're at Easley RC Raceway in Easley, South Carolina. This was the last race on this layout, and as much such, the track was very high in grip. This is where the Agama seemed to be happiest, even though myself as a driver seemed to be lacking as a bit. This was my first time in this layout. The car once again loved to rotate, but was still able to handle high speeds without traction rolling. Once I got more into a groove on the new track, for me, I was able to get around the track quite well, almost like I was running a 10th scale buggy on a medium grip track. Unfortunately, at this point I have to get into the less favorable stuff about the N1e, starting with the durability, specifically of one singular weak point and design casualty of the lack of shock towers, and that's the fact that the wing mount is very easy to break, compared to other buggies. Because there is no shock towers to absorb any impact from an upside down landing, any crash will put pretty much all of that force into the wing mount itself. This excess of force being put on the wing mount, and the fact that the design itself isn't the most durable one for performance reasons, means that you're going to be going through a lot of wing mounts if you happen to crash a lot. Other than that though, pretty much all the breakages I've experienced on this car have been within reason. If I drive arm first into a metal pole at full speed, I expect that arm to break. However, I have heard some people breaking their arms under not so bad crashes due to them being a bit harder than other arms on the market today. This is good for performance in high grip situations, but not so good for durability. It's advised by a lot of Agama drivers to either do the Yokomo thing and boil the arms to make them softer, or purchase the soft arms straight from Agama and Nemo. Another design casualty of the buggy is the lack of droop in suspension travel compared to other buggies. This is something that can limit its ability to handle very bumpy tracks with large jumps, for example most race time events, Western US tracks, and some Eastern US tracks. There are some ways to get around this though. For one, you can run the later iteration of the shock package with slightly longer front bodies and shafts. You can also remove the button from the bottom of the droop screw to add more droop. Or if you really want that expensive suspension travel, you can run the VRP long travel rocker set for the N1e. We'll get to that later. The last thing that I would caution you in terms of the Agama on N1e is part support. The main places you're going to find parts for this buggy is going to be Nemo Racing, Nemo Racing USA, and VisionRacersProducts.com. Even though at the time of me writing this script and me recording this voiceover, all the replacement parts and some of the option parts are all in stock, it is something to watch out for if you're limited in the amount of places you can actually buy parts for your car. Make sure to stock up on parts that break often, like the aforementioned wing mount, and even things that don't, just to be sure. This is something that should be done with all brands, but is more imperative when it comes to lesser used brands like Agama. This is also where I think I've got to talk about the controversy between VRP and Agama as a whole. These two companies are not fond of each other at the moment, and there is a story behind why this is. When the N1 first came out, it did have some design faults that made it less than ideal for American bumpy tracks. For example, in the early iterations of front shocks were even smaller than that they are now, thus making the lack of droop and overall suspension travel not very ideal. VRP began working on a conversion kit to make it more suited towards American tracks. No harm, no foul, right? Well, from what I've been able to gauge from people who are more noticeable than me, whom I will not name, they basically said the reason for the hostility lies in how VRP marketed their conversion kit, basically implying the stock car was garbo and that their conversion kit would unfuck it. Agama took offense to this, and thus Agama drivers aren't allowed to run VRP conversion kits, period. Now there's probably more to the story that I simply am not aware of, but overall it seems like a very ugly situation for the most part, and I don't envy anyone who was caught in the middle of it. For me, the reason why I switched to the standard Agama setup is simple. It's cheaper and easier to find. The VRP kit isn't cheap, and not everyone either wants or has time to spend another $100 on a conversion kit for a buggy they just spent $650 on. Nor would someone want to go through the hassle of making the Agama N1 a VRP N1 from scratch or over time. There are some VRP parts that I would recommend that I'll go over in my next video about the N1e at the North Georgia Shootout. Does this mean I'll be getting rid of the N1e anytime soon? No. I very much enjoy the uniqueness of this buggy, and it's a buggy I've grown to enjoy driving. However, for the purposes of this review and to say whether or not I'd recommend it to someone else, it's hard to say. Like I said before, part support is there from Nemo Racing and VRP, and there is a loyal fanbase for the Agama N1, so chances of you finding a part at a big race on the East Coast may be lower than normal, but not entirely zero. If you're still on the fence about whether or not you want to pull the trigger on one of these N1es, see if you can borrow the controller for a lap or two and see if you like it. If you do, set aside some extra cash for spare parts to buy right out of the gate. Look for setups that cater to your driving style and track, and experiment to see it works for you. For this video, be sure to hit the like button and comment what you think of the buggy in the comment section below. Also, if you'd like to see more, be sure to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Also, if you'd like to support me another way, you can sub to my Patreon, where very soon there will be a surprise. Speaking of which, I'd like to thank my active patrons Michael Williams, RC World Discord server, Casey Nix, Ben Reeves, Dave Armstrong, Rob Bedingfield, Caden Merks, Ian Petrie, Logan Jutkins, Zach Hawes, Jeffrey Kunz, and especially Buddy Howell and Morrison Wad. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.